Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. Thank you for being with me today. My name is Tony Ingrassia. I am your humble host, and we are continuing today with part 2 of an episode series that I started last week by the title of A Theology of Suffering, and the second working title would be The Day of Disaster. And you'll understand what that means when we get to it as we advance through our teaching here. And let me just say that for over 10 years, I pastored a little church in St. Charles, Missouri. The name was the Outpost Church, and we ended up closing the church a year ago in October, in large part because of COVID. We were struggling as a small church in many different ways, but then when COVID came along, it just eventually led to the closure of the church. But the point I'm getting to is that as a pastor, I guess you need to try to be real careful about certain things that you say and what you can say and what you can't say. And I feel like this is a message that I would like to give to the church that I felt like I could never really give the way that I wanted to give it. Almost like there's a bush there, but I can't just jump on the bush. I can't get in the bush. I've got to kind of beat around the bush when I talk about suffering. So I'll just acknowledge that I'm pretty aggressively attacking this subject more directly than I typically would. I'm just trying to be real honest and straightforward. I don't want to be mean or hurtful or cruel, but I'm talking about suffering in this series in a very direct way. And I said that I had 6 principles that I wanted to share with you concerning a theology of suffering. And last week I shared with you the very first principle, which is that this world is deeply wounded, broken, and fallen. And with that being said, it brings me to principle number 2, where we will continue this week. And principle 2 is this: you will experience pain and suffering in this world. Let me say it one more time. Principle 2, you will experience pain and suffering in this world. In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. It's interesting to me to note, guys, just as I read that, it's not even in my notes, but I just want to share this comment, that Jesus presents 2 different possibilities here, 2 different concepts that are almost diametrically opposed to one another. He says, in me you may have peace. So he's establishing the reality that peace is possible. There's something good in this world. You can have peace, but in this world you will have trouble. So isn't it interesting that he sets these 2 ideas side by side, peace and trouble. And then he says, take heart because I have overcome the world. And I think that's very encouraging, you guys, because it indicates to us something of the remedy that we're going to be working toward as we progress through this teaching on a theology of suffering. Does the reality that there's hurt and pain and trauma and confusion and suffering in this world, does it end there? Is that all that we have to hope in? Is that the end of the story? No, it isn't. Because Jesus is saying there's a way that we can find peace in the midst of this world, in the midst of the reality that there is pain and suffering in this world. There is hope. There is possibility. There is redemption. There is a way that we can have peace even in the middle of the trouble. And by the way, just for the fun of it, I looked up this word trouble that Jesus used here. In this world, you will have trouble. And I learned that this particular word, this Greek word, is used 43 different times in the New Testament. And the etymology of the word actually means to be pressed or to come under great pressure. And I see in pictures sometimes, so the picture that I saw, I don't know if it's a fair picture or an accurate picture, but you know how when the winemaker makes wine, he presses the grapes, right? You put the grapes like in this thing in the old days, and they'd have a yoke, and the cow, the oxen, would walk in a circle and turn what they call the millstone, the grindstone, and it's stone on stone, and you feed the grapes in there, and these millstones are literally pressing the grapes. They're crushing the grapes, and as they do, of course, the juice comes out, and this is what the winemaker uses to make the wine. And that's what I thought of when I saw the definition of this word, trouble, when Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. In this world you will be pressed. You will come under great pressure. And in much the same way that the pressing extracts the juice from the grapes, I think the pressing in our lives, sometimes God extracts something. God is calling something forth that He wants to make this wine from our life, from our situation, that our life becomes poetry, and God is making something beautiful, even from the reality that we are being pressed by this world and by our current situation. And then I noticed that this word that's used 43 different times in the New Testament, it's translated 21 of those times as the word tribulation. So in other words, Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. It could be also translated tribulation. So Jesus could have said, in this world you will have tribulation. 18 times is the word affliction. 3 times it's translated with the word trouble, as it is here in John chapter 16, verse 33. 1 time the word anguish, 1 time the word persecution, and 1 time the word burdened. Or said another way, when Jesus said that in this world you will have trouble, it's as if He was saying that in this world you will have tribulation, or in this world you will have affliction, in this world you will have trouble, in this world you will have anguish, in this world you will have persecution, in this world you will be burdened. In Acts chapter 14, verse 22, it says that we enter the kingdom of God through much tribulation. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, it says, in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And by the way, just a free observation there, it says that if you live a godly life, you will be persecuted. And therefore, I think maybe we could extrapolate a principle, I'm not sure. So what that means is that if you're not being persecuted, maybe that implies that you're not living a godly life. Because it says, if you live a godly life, you will be persecuted. And then Philippians chapter 1, verse 29 says, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer for Him. So again, the second point of our theology of suffering is this: you will experience pain and suffering in this world. And I'm sorry, guys, if I have to be the one to announce this to you or to remind you of this, but it's the truth, and therefore I have to tell you the truth. And the fact of the matter is, guys, that this point is even much worse than it appears at first on the surface when we say you will experience pain and suffering. It's really much worse than that. And let me see if I can explain to you what I mean by that. And this is when I get into what would be the second title of this series, what I'm calling the Day of Disaster. And what I mean by that, guys, the Day of Disaster, is that since we live in this wounded and broken and fallen world, and since we will experience pain and suffering in this world, I'm simply advocating that the day of disaster will inevitably come to knock on the front door of each one of our lives. It's inevitable, guys. It's inescapable. There will be a phone call one day, the dreaded phone call. There will be a diagnosis. There will be a prognosis. There will be a car accident. There'll be a sickness. There'll be a disease. There will be a disagreement. There will be a divorce. And on it goes. And all that I'm saying, guys, is that if you're living in this world, there's a very good chance that someday something profoundly difficult is going to happen in your life. There will be some kind of trauma, some kind of a crisis, some kind of a disaster that's going to happen in your life. And I promise you that the day of disaster is literally on its way to your house and to your life right now. And I don't know if it's going to get there today or maybe tomorrow, or maybe 7 months from now, or maybe 11 years from now, or maybe 37 years from now. I don't know when it's going to get there, but I promise you the day of disaster is coming to your life. And by the way, I pray in Jesus' name that it's going to happen much later than it is sooner. But all that I'm saying here, guys, is that it's reality. It's inevitable that something profoundly difficult is going to happen in my life and in your life, and it's part of the reality of living in this wounded and this broken world. And let me just say a couple things here, guys, that I'll throw in for free. 2 different thoughts that are occurring to me. The first one is that this is something that I absolutely hated as a part of my job as a pastor. Because when you're a pastor, you have to walk through the most profound and hurtful and painful and traumatic and horrible situations of people's lives, right? Because you're pastoring this church, and our church wasn't even that big. We didn't even have 100 members. On a good Sunday, we'd have 60, 70 people. And there were many times that I felt overwhelmed just trying to help 50, 60, 70 people deal with life. It was overwhelming because there would be an endless parade of issues that were emerging in people's lives as they live in this wounded, broken, and fallen world. And I feel like I could do a message series, and the title could be something like Suicide, Sickness, Wheelchairs, Incarceration, and Caskets. Because these are the kind of things that would emerge that people were dealing with in the context of our congregation. These profoundly difficult things would happen, and then it's my duty as a pastor to go and to sit with people and to be with people and to pray with people, which I considered a great honor. I'm not saying that I wasn't honored to do that, but it's just really difficult. And sometimes what people do is they look to you because they can't see God, right? God's not there to say anything audibly to them in that moment of struggle and pain and suffering. So they can't see God, but they can see me because I'm the pastor and they can hear my words. So I'm called into the situation to kind of represent God and to speak on God's behalf. And that's what I mean when I say that this could be really, really hard, because I feel like I was being put in these situations where I'm trying to almost explain to them how this happened, or why this happened, or why did God allow this to happen. And people are looking at you, and their lives are shattered, and their hearts are broken, and they're full of pain, and their soul is bleeding, and they're asking, why did this happen? Why did God let this happen? And what do I have to offer? I'm trying to explain. I'm trying to use my words. And sometimes I felt like I'm almost like trying to make an excuse for God. Like I'm trying to cover God's butt, and I've got to somehow vindicate God and the character of God and somehow explain to people how and why God would allow such a thing to happen. And it just was very, very difficult. And it's not something that I necessarily loved about the position of being a pastor sometimes. And the second thing I wanted to say, and I'm just thinking out loud right now, you guys, this isn't even in my notes, but I feel like I could give another sermon. This would be another one of those sermons that I could not give as a pastor of a church. It would be like too direct, too blatant, too offensive, too hurtful. And the title of the message would be something like, Kick God out of your life now. Just go ahead and kick God out of your life. Because when something bad happens, when the phone call comes, when the diagnosis comes, when the day of disaster comes to knock on the front door of your life, I'm so sorry. I don't want it to happen. I hope it never happens. But when it happens, if you're going to kick God out of your life on that day, if you're going to say, where is God? How could God be a God of love? Why would God let this happen? I can't believe in this God. This God can't be good. This God cannot love me. Well, if you're going to kick God out of your life on that day, then friend, let me just tell you, go ahead and kick God out of your life right now. Because chances are this day is going to come. And if your faith is based upon or predicated upon the fact or the hope that nothing bad will ever happen in your life, and as long as there's no crisis and there's no trauma, there's no phone call, there's no diagnosis, there's no car accident, nothing bad happens, then I can believe in you, God. Then I will trust in you and I will believe that you are good because nothing bad has happened in my life. And if something bad happens, then I can't believe anymore. All that I'm saying is you may as well go ahead and kick God out of your life today. Get it over with because chances are something bad is going to happen. So what I'm saying, friend, is we can't just believe in God and put our hope in God and hold on to God because everything's good, and then when something bad happens, I can't believe anymore. No, the true test of faith is, will you continue to believe in God when the day of disaster comes? Will you continue to believe in God if you end up in a wheelchair, like my friend Steve Van Valen? Will you continue to believe in God if your son gets incarcerated, like some other dear friends of mine? Will you continue to believe in God if there's a suicide or if your child is sick? Will you continue to hold on to God? Will you continue to trust God? Will you continue to believe in God, even on the day of disaster? And with that being said, you guys, do you know what I think is about as good as this thing's going to get? And I might be wrong, and maybe I'm being too pessimistic right now, and maybe this whole thing that I'm presenting in these episodes right now is colored and shaded by the clouds that are in my personal life at this time. 2021 absolutely was the hardest year of my life. I went through all these horrible, crazy things. The worst of all is that my wife filed for divorce, a divorce that I don't want. My heart has absolutely been broken. I've been grieving for the past 6 months. I mean, I can't even begin to put words to how difficult it's been. But through the midst of that, you guys, I can't let go of God. It's like that thing when Peter said, Lord, where are we going to go? We don't have anywhere else to go. It's like I've been a believer in Christ for 50 years now, almost 50 years. And I've loved God and served God the best I could, even though I've been an incredibly imperfect servant of God. But I've given my whole life to the Lord. So what am I going to do? Quit believing in God because the going's getting tough, because some difficult things have happened in my life? No, I'm not going to give up on God. I don't know how to do that. So all I can do is continue to hold on to God. But the point I was just getting to, I was thinking something. I think about as good as it gets is what happened to my dad. And my dad died on April 22nd, 2002. And I cannot believe that this coming April, just a few months from now, will be 20 years that my father died. And he literally dropped dead one day with a massive heart attack, which was absolutely horrible and profoundly difficult to lose your father in that way. And it was especially difficult for me because at the time my father died, my relationship with him was very broken. And my father would not talk to me for the last 2 years of his life. But that's another story in and of itself. But the point that I'm getting to is that was terrible, but in a way it was a blessing. And I really think that it's the way that my father would have preferred to die. Because if you think about it, He's married to his wife, Mary, my mother. They have 6 children. They have all these grandchildren, like 18 grandchildren or 20 grandchildren, whatever it is. I don't even know offhand. And it's inevitable that somebody has to die first, right? And my dad was lucky enough and blessed enough that he got to die first, and he literally dropped dead one day. So what I'm trying to say is he didn't have to see his wife suffer. He didn't have to see his wife die. He didn't have to see any one of his 6 kids die. He didn't have to see any of his grandchildren die, right? So it's almost like, in a way, my dad was spared of the day of disaster. Of course, he had his own challenges and dilemmas and situations and hardships and sufferings in life. I would never minimize that. But as far as this catastrophic day of disaster, it never came to his life. He never had to deal with it because he just died. And therefore, in a way, his death became the day of disaster for those of us that were left behind, because now we had to confront the reality of his death and grieve losing him and all of that. So here we have the day of disaster. So all that I'm saying is that I think that if you have to die the way my dad died, maybe God blessed him. But anyway, I'm just thinking out loud, you guys, right now. But in view of what we're talking about here, guys, and in view of the first 2 points of this presentation that I've now shared with you, point 1 was this world is deeply wounded, broken, and fallen. Point 2 is you will experience pain and suffering in this world. It's in view of these first 2 points that I want to dare to answer what might be one of the most common questions ever asked about God, and certainly one of the most common accusations that's leveled against God by people. And there could be many different ways to ask the question, but the basic question is this: why does God allow pain and suffering? Or maybe you could ask it this way: how can God be a God of love yet allow things like disease and starvation and sickness and death to exist? Or maybe we could ask it this way: how can God be a good God and allow babies to suffer and die? And by the way, it's questions like these that lead people to at least 4 different conclusions about God that I've been able to identify. And here are those 4 conclusions that people draw about God. Number 1, some people decide God does not even exist, because if he did exist, there's no way he would allow such things to happen. So the fact that these things happen actually prove that God does not exist. Number 2 is some people decide that God does exist, but he simply doesn't care about us. He's far, far away from us. He's detached, he's disengaged, he's uninvolved, he doesn't care. The third thing that some people decide about God in the shadow of suffering is that he does exist, but he must not be all-powerful. Because if he had the power to change things, or if he had the power to prevent these bad and horrible things from happening, he would do so. So the fact that these terrible things happen prove that God is not all-powerful. And the fourth thing that some people decide about God is that he does exist, but that he's a cruel God, and he's a sadistic God who actually delights in tormenting and torturing our lives, like Sid from the movie Toy Story. If you remember, the main character was Woody, the little cowboy, and his sidekick was Buzz, the space robot. And there was Sid. He was the antagonist of the movie, the bad guy, Sid. And Sid would take his toys and he would torture them. He would burn them with matches or with a magnifying glass, and he'd put firecrackers on them and blow them up. So some people decide that's what God's like. God is like Sid, this great Sid up in the sky whose job is to torment our lives. And people come to these different conclusions about God because of all the pain and suffering in this world. And therefore, this question emerges that makes total sense. People quite naturally ask the question, why does God allow this pain and suffering? Why does God allow it? And I'm going to dare to answer the question, you guys. I'm going to answer the question the best I can. And my answer to the question is basically found in the first 2 points that we have now covered in this podcast episode series, A Theology of Suffering. Why does God allow pain and suffering? I'll tell you why. Because number one, this world is deeply wounded, broken, and fallen. And number two, you will experience pain and suffering in this world. That's why bad things happen, you guys. That's why there's pain and suffering. That's why there's trauma. That's why these horrible things happen, because we are living in a profoundly broken world, and it is inevitable that these things are going to happen. And let me just say that if a person doesn't understand these first two principles, that we live in a deeply wounded, broken, and fallen world, and if they don't understand that you will experience pain and suffering in this world, then this person does not yet understand what this world is. Or maybe they're not accepting what this world is, or maybe they're not being honest with themselves, or maybe they're living in a kind of denial. But one thing's for sure, they don't understand what the reality of this world is. And they don't understand how deeply wounded and broken and fallen this world is. And in the way of a metaphor, even though I think it's a really silly, maybe terrible metaphor, imagine if a person was going to go on vacation, so they book a trip through a travel agent, and this travel agent is a really bad travel agent. So they send this person on this vacation, and the person gets there, and they're in their week of vacation now, and unbeknownst to them, their vacation is right in the middle of a war zone. And all of a sudden, this fighting breaks out, and there's bullets whizzing and bombs exploding, and there's people getting killed to the right, and horrible bloodshed and explosions. And they're thinking, how can I have a vacation? Of all the places this booking agent sent me on my vacation, this was the worst place he could have sent me. How terrible would it be to be on a vacation in the middle of a war zone? And I think what happens to so many people is they misunderstand what this world is. This world is a war zone. And we want it to be a vacation. We want to put up our umbrella and have our iced tea and sip our tea and enjoy the sun and have a nice time and be relaxed and no pressure, no problems, no issues. Everything is great. I'm on vacation. And it turns out this isn't a vacation. I'm in the middle of a war zone right now. So it then leads us to this question, you guys. What are we going to do about this? What do we do about this reality? How do we make the best of this really difficult situation and the fact that we're living in a wounded, broken, fallen world, and that it's inevitable that painful and hurtful and difficult things, that suffering is going to happen in each one of our lives? Is it possible for us to have a meaningful and fulfilling life despite the pain and suffering that we will inevitably experience? Is it even possible? And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock that I'm out of time for today's episode. And I kind of hate to end here because I feel like today's episode has been so pessimistic. But let me say this, that we are now at the low point of our theology of suffering. The reality that this world is broken and the reality that we will experience suffering. I've tried to state this as honestly and as directly as I possibly can. I don't want to be mean. I don't want to be cruel or hurtful, but I want to be direct and I want to be honest and I want to tell you the truth, my understanding of the Bible and of God and of this world, and how I'm making sense of the suffering of my own life. So we are now at the low point. This is the lowest point, the darkest point. And next week, I'm going to begin to share with you 4 different principles that I really believe will be helpful and encouraging and inspire hope. So please come back, stick with me, and we will continue to develop our theology of suffering. And before I close today's episode, guys, I want to throw in one little announcement that's very exciting, and I want to encourage you to consider taking the leap. Because what if you had the strategies and tools that you needed at your fingertips that would enable you to say no at the moment of temptation and to handle the triggers that cause most men to act out sexually and to control your body instead of being controlled by your body and to stop looking at internet pornography? Well, we have an upcoming Pathway to Purity intensive workshop. It's going to be a live workshop, February 25th through the 27th, 2022, and you invest one weekend and it's going to change your life. So I would love for you to come to St. Louis and hang out with me for a weekend. We're going to have this intensive and it's going to be totally awesome. And you can get more information at the Power of Purity website. There's a link at the top of the page that says Live Intensive. Check it out. In the meantime, be blessed, you guys. Have an awesome week. I pray for God's blessings over you, the light of God over you, the strength of God, the wisdom of God, the protection of God, the mercies of God, the grace of God, and angels all around you, and the blood of Jesus over you. I'll look forward to seeing you right back here next week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.